title for this class this week, special Omer edition, is Gerim Grurim. The subject matter in particular of Gerim Grurim is the Ger of the end of days. Not many people are aware of the fact that there is a Ger of the end of days. But in fact, the Ger is primarily an end of days creation in Torah. We know the Torah has many types of people. Bnei Yisrael, children of Israel, Gerim, widows, Levites, Kohanim, Israelites, many types of people. The Ger is actually more of a character than some might realize. Every parsha of the Torah contains something somewhere of Ger. The prophecies of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the main prophets, are heavily influenced with Ger imagery. Most notably Isaiah 14:1. The Ger will be grafted into the house of Jacob. With that said, there's a current Ger movement in the world that maybe has started as a B'nai Noach movement, calling itself Noahide. And as the more these Noahides have grown and have sought God, as opposed to some kind of group identity, but a real identification and relationship with God, as if to find oneself in the Torah to say, that's me. The budding Noahide was that. And the that we speak of is actually called Ger. The Bible, the 5 books of Moses, Old Testament, the Chumash, whatever you call it, only knows of Ger. It never heard of a Noahide, of a Noahite, or any other word you want to place upon these people. The Torah speaks very clearly about none other than Ger, which not only often begs the question, but begs the question, who is the Ger? The most famous Ger that ever lived, quite possibly, was Onkelos the Ger, the translation of the Torah under his pen. And he has his own code to the Ger that flows the entire span of the Torah of Moses. Each Ger on location is explained by Onkelos the Ger, whether he be the Ger uncircumcised, the Ger who has settled with you, many types of Ger. But it's an ancient code, one that needs understood to fully grasp the import of the Ger movement and concept and people. And with that, there's a whole lineage of rabbis over time who have helped unpack the Ger. Today we call that Ger Toshav. And for those that don't like that term, we can simply call him the Ger. As we know, Ger Toshav is a problematic term. Everybody knows the Rambam says, but there is no Ger Toshav until the time of the Jubilee. And there is no Jubilee today, and there's not one in any foreseeable future. So what do we do with a movement that calls itself Ger? It's predicted there would be Ger, but yet we don't have any Ger. We're told there's only idolaters among us. Yet you may be standing and talking and associated with a bona fide person who calls himself Ger. He has rejected idolatry, has left the church, really doesn't resemble a goy in any respect or sense. What do you call him? We've called him the Ger Toshav, Noahide, Noahite, God-fearer, spiritual searcher on a journey. But the rabbis have a different tradition. They're not the non-Jew. They see it under rabbinic eyes. For them, there's another character in the Torah, one that many people might not be familiar with or have heard of. Much like the children of Israel became Jews, the Gerim at some point, about the same time of the Jews, the Purim miracle, became the Gerim Grurim. The Gerim in the days of Mordechai and Esther went from being stam random goyim to seeing Israel's greatness and redemption, followed Israel out, and they became the quintessential Gerim Mordechai Esther, those who see the greatness of Israel and are compelled to follow after them. We saw it with the Erev Rav in Egypt. We saw it in the days of Mordechai. We saw it in the days of David and Shlomo. And obviously it goes without saying, we will see it again in the end of days, when Israel will gain prominence in the world, return to their land, and the nations of the world will recognize the strength of Yaakov. You would have to be a fool today to say that does not exist where we are in time and space. The Jews are on their land. We have strength. If you don't believe me, just ask Iran. Ask the nations about how strong Israel is. They'll say too strong for her own good. And there's a worldwide movement of Gerim out of nowhere. I just love the God of Israel, he says. My heart feels Jewish, he says. They might call themselves Gerim, Ger Toshav. The rabbi doesn't know who you are, and there's no jubilee to vouch for who you are. They call you the Gerim Grurim. And here is a bit of information of the Gerim Grurim through the eyes of 2,000 years of rabbinic views. Chazal, various rabbis who have spoken about the imminent return of the Gerim to the world scene called the Gerim Grurim, the prophetic ger of the end of days. The first rabbi we'll bring to the stage is the first chief rabbi of Israel, who followed in the footsteps of Rav Kook, the father of Zionism and the modern state of Israel. Judaism in Israel is essentially Rav Kook. His job was to father the Yishuv, the settlement of early Palestine, as it was called in its secular terms. But the Jews knew it as a return to the land of Israel. That return to the strip of land that was uninhabited as a state now had an essential problem. Even though it was inhabited by Jews since the time of the Second Destruction and obviously beforehand, now that it's institutionalized as a people, a nation, a place, a concept in the world, several key issues would come to the forefront. How do we deal with a Jew in the land of Israel, a true Israelite on his land after 2,000 years of waiting? And with a world of Gerim Grurim looking on, what are they going to do? How do they eat? Is the land holy and kosher? Is it spiritual still with the Shekhinah? Does there have to be provisions and takanas, gezeras, establishments to make living here possible? How do we use the Torah to live in the land of Israel? Number one, every 7 years there's a Shemitah. The land goes to rest, and you can not do certain things with the land that requires a non-Jew to be in partnership with the Jews. This state of existence, Jews in the land having to deal with this, and the non-Jewish requirement of cooperation with the Jews in order for their Yishuv to work. Rav Kook had to deal with such a situation. And the solution was the Ger Toshav. In fact, the Ger Toshav never wasn't. It always was, is, and will be. Many people think that only with the Jubilee is there a Ger Toshav. The Brisker Rav will tell you that's actually not true. There are ways of a lesser existence without the Jubilee. Much like a married couple who separates in time of impurity, the non-Jubilee Ger has a lack of full rights granted. That does not mean he does not exist. His 7 laws of Noah, craftsmanship and guardian, and fulfillment of these laws guarantees that he is a Ger Toshav and has right to live in the land. And the Jewish living in the land is contingent and requires him to exist. Rav Kook was the father of these statutes in the modern era. Not to create them from scratch, but to unearth them, polish them off, and reintroduce them, much like the Shekhinah coming out of exile from the dust. But there's a lot of problems with this. The biggest problem, the first chief rabbi of Israel is going to have this problem. We have a little bit of a problem with our neighbor, the Egyptian state, who lives alongside Israel. The Torah says, do not bring them into your association. But here we have a budding state of Israel where they have to interact with us. And the answer goes like this. To paraphrase what's written in this paper right here, from Heichel Yitzchak. A nation to become Gerim by their own volition before the coming of the Redeemer will never happen. If it would have happened, the Khuzaris would have become Gerim, and they didn't. But in the time the Mashiach is in the air, which many believe the state of Israel is at least a part of such a revelation. If the non-Jews, even in their own land and their own sovereignty, if they would become Gerim Grurim, chase after the God of Israel, become Noahides, whether through a Beit Din Yisrael, whether by their own acclamation upon their own selves, to become holy through you, Israel, would remove the impurity that came upon the nations from Sinai through the golden calf episode. They would be removed from the general category of goyim, idolaters. They can become holy through you, and all forbidden relationships would fall down. Now, we're not suggesting they marry your daughter, but in terms of interaction, land, cooperation, and coexistence, they would be able to function in a Middle East that recognizes the God of Israel. And the rabbi suggests, don't be afraid of such a condition. Just because they become holy through you doesn't mean, God forbid, my providence is then removed from you and placed upon them. And don't think that if you fall from your level of existence in mitzvot and relationship with God, then it's removed from you. He says that God says, my providence is with you, Israel. They become holy through you. They are merely attaching to you through their elevation, through either becoming some type of ger toshav, Zion mitzvahs, b'nei Noach, Noahide, whatever label that is non-goy, non-idolater that they end up with. There's nothing to fear only, but their attachment to Israel is the change of condition for them. They become recognized by God, and they recognize God. And this can happen simply by a choice of them upon themselves to be under the wings of the Shekhinah. The Rediscovers says as much as well. How does one go from being a goy to a ger toshav? Simply by saying, I am a ger toshav. I accept the 7 laws of Noah. That alone makes him fundamentally different. And should he go back on that, I am now a goy, an idolater, I do not believe in ger toshav. He is now not a ger toshav. He can oscillate as much as he wants. Now, his soul is in peril. He should make up his mind and go with the ways of God. But should he waver and oscillate, such is the nature of man. It is our job to be a light to nations, to support the concept of a non-Jew recognizing God. And be the light to nations, and the prophesied end of all peoples is to be ger toshav and recognize God. A clear language will be switched for the peoples of the earth. That is the Gerim Grurim. They are compelled to come after Israel when Israel is strong. To say we are not strong today is basically foolish. We're Jews on our land and we're sovereign. The only question is, why do we not take back the Temple Mount? That's a different story, but that's not a problem with our power. The power is that we're Jews on the land and we have the Torah and the ability to even bring redemption if the light would just go out. To continue about the Gerim Grurim, there's a famous passage in Avodah Zorah, I believe 3b. There will be dawn and Cladden with, or lad and Cladden, whatever the word is, with their tefillin on their head and the arms, tzitzit hanging from their clothes, mezuzah in their doorpost, and they're going to come. And many people say this is a type of Messianic Jew, which fits the imagery quite well. And that is the Gerim Grurim. Some will come with a brazen approach and chutzpah, and we are the true Jews. We have tefillin. And the Torah says, come. We've been waiting for you and anticipating. You're going to come by your own strength when Israel's not able to accept you, says Rashi, as the definition of Gerim Grurim. So such things are not unprecedented. These things are not unexpected. They might not be the best approach to say, come and be chutzpahdik, to come and knock your way in. But yet it has been anticipated. The next logical question is, what is Gerim Grurim? What is Grurim? Grurim comes from the language Garur. Monag al yidei aliyas madregas ruchnius, says the Ramchal. They go up in a level of spirituality. Jews are not saying, hey, come aboard and be one of us. In fact, we're saying, don't come. Simply from lack of information, lack of precedent, lack of calling. But yet the Gerim Grurim, the nations of the world in the end of days, who are reacting to Israel's paramount ascension to the land of Israel and the Temple Mount, in theory, as it's only a question why we don't recapture the Temple Mount. Thus the nations are compelled. If the Jews are strong, we want to be there, which is the definition of Gerim Grurim, Gerim Mordechai Esther. The non-Jews who see Jewish greatness and then are compelled to drive themselves towards that. Grur means to be dragged. Even against their will, they say, in my heart I feel Jewish, in my heart I feel for Israel, in my heart I recognize the God of Israel. I must go to these people. Fantastic as it may be, we see it in our days. Thus the language of Gerim Grurim is Gerim, who are Megayer. They're converting their souls. They're removing the separation, that is the conversion, to allow the penetration of God. And the Grur is dynamically progressing forward for a spiritual ascension, simply wishing to shed the label of Goy, idolater, and exchanging it for a child of God. Another connotation is they're coming from very far, and now they happen to be close. Who could fathom such an existence in the history of creation? Yet with advents of the internet, suddenly you can have them knocking on your internet door. So far away, and yet Skype phone calls all day long can be like your next door neighbor. Far and near doesn't exist in this generation. All that knock or wish to come close can and do become close. We've all heard about the Erev Rav, the mixed multitude, the evil, the Amalek, the golden calf. And it's become a bad word. Nobody wants to be Erev Rav. God forbid. Am I Erev Rav? They ask. The answer is yes, you are. And it's not a bad word. It's not what we thought it was. It's not the boogeyman. The Erev Rav is the spiritual entity that says a mixed multitude is coming with you. What becomes of them? That's the question. If you want to create anti-Semitism in the world, yes, you can create an Amalekite from that. Not hard. But you can also create the Ger. Moses brought out the Erev Rav. God said no, but God was putting the friction necessary for the Gerim. And Moses said, the goal of Torah and Jew is to make Gerim. Thus the first level of the Erev Rav as Gerim Grurim is to come out, be removed, and shake the evil out of them. Maybe you could call that the Nachri stage, where you first realize perhaps Jesus is not the Messiah. Then you have the Noahide stage. Then there's many stages, infinite amount of stages. But eventually one will settle and say, where I am, I'm good with God, I'm good with you, I'm good with the Torah of Israel. At that point, there's no more Erev Rav. There's no more klippa or shell or impurity or division. Only the good remains, and that is what attaches itself to Israel. Should you not wish to attach to Israel, that's your prerogative as well. But the focus, the scope of Gerim Grurim is the perpetual motion to come close until you say, I'm close enough to the point where I'm settled. I'm comfortable where I am. And inevitably, that's when Israel, much as they push off the Gerim Grurim, in the end, as it says, we come to accept them. It's when we find the happy medium, that's when the acceptance is granted. We know that it's famous in the Bible, in the Torah of Moses, the Chumash, 46 times it warns, do not taunt the ger to love the ger. Interestingly enough, the gerim grurim is under the label of lo tono, do not taunt the ger. This is the essence of this enactment. They're coming to you. They are the most vulnerable for taunting. They're coming in. You're saying, who are you? Why would you come to us? You don't belong here. And it can become quite nasty, rude, unwarranted. And the Torah says, love the ger. You don't have to bring them over. You don't have to marry your daughter to them, share wine, get drunk, have a jolly good time. But don't be rude. The Talmud says, even the idolater, you don't send him away to throw him back to the pit. And for that you love the ger and you don't taunt the ger. The gerim grurim are even attached on the 12 tribes of Israel coming out of Egypt. This is the secret behind Jacob's wives, Rachel, Leah, and the maidservants, the shifchot. There's prophecy within Jacob himself. The gerim grurim would find what to attach to. These would become the nilvim, the attachments to Jacob. As we mentioned, Isaiah 14:1. They'll become the nilvim, the attachment grafted into the house of Jacob. In the end, they will be brought in. They will not become converts. There will be no more need for a convert. They will simply be the gerim, the fourth house of Israel, those of it who have turned their soul to recognize God. At that point, there is no gerim grurim. There's ger toshav, who on that day Hashem is one, His name is one, and the world will be turned to the language of God, a clear language for them all. Interestingly enough, the Rambam can be seen as a stumbling block for the gerim grurim. But here we have a commentary on the Rambam who says that they're megrarim b'Yisrael. They're chasing after Israel, and Israel does not bring them close. We don't proselytize and say, come on over and have fun. But we don't distance them completely either. In fact, what we do is eventually we deal with the gerim grurim, ger toshav, and we settle them with where they're supposed to be. And there's a world of vernacular and rabbinic terminology that simply educates the rabbi who are the gerim. And at that point, there's no need to stick with labels, but they're simply ger, and they are attached to Israel, and they simply want a relationship with God. And to continue the line with the Rambam, a whole plethora and world of new terminology comes about. The gerim grurim, who complete their conversion, so to speak, they made it in by their own volition and determination. He becomes ger gamor. He completed his ger grurim. He's settled. He's giura, according to Onkelos. You might know him as the ger tzedek. But an interesting new term come about. And this ger tzedek convert is actually ger tzedek lechachila. He did it the optimal way. He dunked, he circumcised, will marry him to your daughter to him. You don't have to check with him for the wine and kashrut. He is effectively an Israelite. But the ger who does not just dunk and say, I take on everything, here I am, we're suspicious of him. We don't want to share wine simply because he's not Jewish, doesn't want to be Jewish, doesn't have to be Jewish. He wants God. It's our job to not taunt him, to love him, educate about God, simply be a mensch, light to nations, and help your fellow man. He's allowed to learn Torah, he can do the mitzvot. He is settled where he wants to be. An interesting term in the Rambam says, ger tzedek b'diavad, meaning he's ger, he's righteous, but b'diavad, meaning He's not Jewish. B'di'evid in lechatchila means like this. Let's suppose that the shecht, a giraffe, who has a massive neck, you say the best place to shecht a giraffe is here, by tradition. But because the neck is so long, it could be anywhere. Lechatchila, you do it in the prescribed place of the rabbis, but if you do it here, here, it doesn't matter. It's kosher. In that you did it, okay, but don't do it again. So the lechatchila Ger Tzedek says he did it in the fact that we don't have anything to be worrying about as Jews. If he comes over, can he daven? Can he not daven? Can he eat our food? Those suspicions in halacha are gone. The Ger Toshav, it's a big question. If we have 9 men in a minyan, can he be the 10th man? We don't know. Those answers come up when we need to come up with the answer. I.e., you look into the books and you find the answer. But if you're not motivated to find the answer, you don't know the answer. So you're not supposed to pray with 9 Jews and a non-Jew. But b'di'evid you might have to, if that's the halacha. I mean, you don't set out to do it, but if it happens, it happens. And Jewish halacha operates like this on every level. The Gerim Grurim are that. And a very simple answer for over time has been, if you convert, it's easier for everybody. But yet we're in a bit of cognitive dissonance that we don't make proselytes or convert. We don't make converts. Compare that with the fact that we do make Gerim, and you're looking at a very divided people. And for that reason, we don't accept converts in the end of days. It's a complicated world of the Gerim Grurim. But not without precedent, and not without the proper literature. And the distinctions and labels don't need to be. Because again, Gerim Grurim is a rabbinic halachic term to simply say din of the Ger Toshav, or in other words, he keeps the 7 laws of Noah. In the end of days, there will be the Gerim Grurim in rabbinic terms. In the prophetic terms, there will be the Nevi'im, the attachments to Jacob. The Ger of the Bible of Moses, the Chumash, speaks simply of Ger. Sometimes it's the Ger with you, the Ger in your gate, the Ger of the future. Our job is to be ready when the Gerim Grurim are to come back. And if we are as strong as the land of Israel says we are, and we are seeing the Gerim Grurim before us, then it is paramount, in the words of Rabbi Ginsburg, if we have sovereignty in our land, then it is our responsibility and duty to be a light to the Gerim Grurim. But for those that don't feel so comfortable with these terms, Ger Tzedek, b'di'evid, l'chila, Gerim Grurim, Gerim Mordechai Esther Gerim, they're simply Ger. Even Toshav is a label of how they'll be in the end of days in recognition with God. The Torah of Moses simply calls them Ger. And whatever they call themselves, or the attachments of Israel, is really irrelevant. There will be a people coming who fear God and see the greatness of God in the end of days. God willing, we're there now, and it is our duty and responsibility of light to nations to be light to nations and make God proud and visible to all in the world, because that is the truth, is that God's light is in the world, and it is our job to serve in that light. And that happens nowhere really but in the completion and fulfillment of the 3rd temple may be built soon in our days, where all nations and peoples will come and recognize God, serve God, pray to God. And I'll close on this note. In those days I will switch their language to a clear and simple, smooth language. That's what will be spoken in the Holy Temple, the 3rd temple that will become built. It may come soon in our days, all men to be able to interact in a world that understands God. Amen. King hear its home. God bless.